Thank you. Welcome all to the first webinar promoted by the Gender Equality Working Group for the G20 Interfaith Forum. I'm so happy to have you here. My name is Sofia Caseiro. I am one of the co-chairs of this working group, and I have been tasked to moderate the conversation with these two amazing women today. I would like to welcome all of you that took the time to join us in discussing the impact of COVID-19 on women. I would also like to thank the team of the Gender Equality Working Group, the men and women that have been committed to discussing gender equality in this interfaith space. It has been a pleasure to learn and share with all of you. And finishing my thank you round, if you will allow me, I would also like to thank our partners for committing to have these discussions about gender equality in the interfaith space. At this webinar, we had as partners ACWE, a common word among the youth, the European Center for Religious Studies, the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation, and Freedom Business Alliance. Thank you all for your support. Just on an introductory note, for those joining that is the first time on this, having contact with the G20 Interfaith Forum, the G20 Interfaith Forum offers an annual platform where a network of religiously linked institutions and initiatives engage on global agendas, including the Sustainable Development Goals. And the goal of the G20 Interfaith Forum is to contribute meaningful insight and recommendations that respond to and help shape the G20 and global policy agendas. So the commitment with the global agenda has motivated the G20 Interfaith Forum to have a dedicated group for gender equality, following the SDG number 5, the achievement of gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. So this is our first webinar of the Gender Equality Working Group, as I've mentioned, and we chose this topic, the impact of COVID-19 on women, because after more than a year living in a pandemic, we thought that it would be very useful for us as a working group that we are, as we are developing a policy brief, but also to all of the actors that can benefit from these activities at the G20 Interfaith Forum to have a discussion about this topic. We know that women have been in positions of vulnerability and that this pandemic increased that vulnerability. In the UN policy brief about the impact of COVID-19 on women, we found out that the setback on the rights of women impacted by the pandemic can put at risk, and I'm quoting here, the limited gains made in the past decades. Women were impacted across every sphere of society, from health to the economic security to social protections, and they were impacted worsely simply by the virtue of their sex. In the New York Times investigation, we found out that when schools and childcare shut down, 5.1 million American mothers stopped working for pay, and now 1.3 million of them remain out of work. So the UN policy brief also stated that economically the situation of women has been aggravated. The health of women was also impacted, not only as a result of COVID-19, but by the reallocation of resources and priorities. And the necessity of care work, usually unpaid, has also increased, and women have responded to that need. So we have invited two amazing speakers to be here with us and to share some thoughts, questions, solutions about this topic, and hopefully at the end of this webinar with new ideas and fresh solutions so that we can look forward to this after pandemic world. So we have with us, and I'm sorry for pronouncing your name wrong, I'm sorry. Now we have with us Sadhvi Bhawati Saraswati, Secretary General of the Global Interfaith Wash Alliance, an international organization dedicated to clean water, sanitation, and hygiene, and President of the Divine Shakti Foundation. Sadhvi is well known throughout India and the world for her humanitarian causes, sustainable development, and women's empowerment, and she serves on the UN Faith Advisory Council on Religion. It is a pleasure to have you here with us. We also have with us Dr. Olivia Wilkinson. She is the Director of Research of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, focusing on the role of faith actors in the humanitarian and development sectors. Since early 2020, she has assisted with the religious responses to COVID-19 database project, which looks closely at how the pandemic has affected religious actors and vulnerable communities, including women. She's also a part of the Religion, Health, and Wellbeing Working Group at the G20 Interfaith Forum. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. So this is going to be a dialogue. I want you to I'm going to pose you some questions and we can share amongst ourselves. So my first question to you both is, in your work, what observations have you made of the impact of COVID-19 on women? I think, Sadvi, could you answer first, please?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm so glad to be here today. So honored to be joining in this beautiful and really essential conversation. When we commit to leave no one behind, we can only do that when we become aware of who is getting left behind, how and when they're getting left behind. So it's wonderful to be together. Our work is in a lot of different places. So when you say our work, but our work on the ground takes place in India, primarily in the Himalayan regions. And so we work with village communities, we work with rural communities, we even work with a kind of semi-urban communities. Just the population of India is so big that even places that in Indian standards are small, by our standards are actually quite large. So we work with a lot of those populations. We also, of course, though, work with people all over the world. And I mention that because I'll share with you from both sides, primarily the on the ground people, but it's also important that we look at other communities we are connected to and working with digitally. So we know that in India, throughout India, and our state is not only no exception, but it's particularly hit by a lot of this. COVID has been horrendous. It's been horrendous all over the world. Women's access to everything has been severely diminished. And what we've seen in India is that the working women's ability to be out there earning a living has been pretty decimated, actually. More than 15 million women in India lost their jobs just in the very first month of the COVID lockdown. And that's nearly 40% of the female workforce. So if you realize that almost 40% of the workforce of women lost their jobs in just the first month of the first lockdown, you begin to realize how serious the problem is. In the year between October of 2019 and October 2020, the overall workforce of women throughout that year shrank by about 10% for women, whereas it was only about 2% for men. So there's that huge divide in economics. And yet what we're also seeing in a related and yet separate as well is that, like other places in the world, rates of domestic violence skyrocketed. Our state, tragically, our state of Uttarakhand had the highest rate of domestic violence, which is really sad because population-wise, it's actually a really small state. So for us to have higher numbers, not just higher percentages, but higher numbers of domestic violence incidents, reports, is really a great tragedy. And we're seeing that primarily with regard to feelings of great helplessness in the men. Our state is not a wealthy state. It's a mountainous state. It's a village state. In the vast, overwhelming majority of cases, the men who work, as well as when the women are working, they're hand to mouth. They're kind of daily wage earners, or they're working in fields and relying on the markets to be able to sell things. And so when the economy plummets, there's of course the sense of powerlessness and frustration that they then come home and consume large amounts of alcohol. Alcoholism is a severe problem pre-COVID in any case in our state. There's a saying, Suraj ast, Garwali must. And it means like when the sun sets, the people of the mountains are in bliss, but it really means they're drunk. And so that's been the case for decades and decades, but COVID, of course, exacerbated that. And rates of alcoholism and therefore the domestic violence that ensued just skyrocketed. We also know that women have had much less access to the technology that has been a great boon in helping us overcome the challenges of COVID. So where kids are studying online, people are working from home, not only are their jobs not jobs that one even could do from home, but they don't even have, in a lot of cases, access to the internet to be able to search for new things, to learn things, to find out more about government subsidies, for example. So we know that their access to all of that type of technology and communication is significantly less. And it actually was interesting because we run several programs for women's empowerment and upliftment and training. And during the first lockdown, we actually spent months putting into plan a whole new center, an expanded center with computer programs and spoken English, because we knew that after COVID, we were going to be in much, much worse shape. And the center was able to open for about 3 weeks before it had to be shut down again due to the massive second wave. So what you've got is this digital divide, the lack of access to technology. And then because of the COVID rates, the centers where they actually can be provided with this, schools, training centers, etc., are closed. So we're also seeing that as a major problem. But lastly, just to mention that we do work with a lot of women all over the world who are not necessarily in that very, very challenging rural, village, urban, poor setting. And a lot of those women, both throughout India as well as across the world, have flourished in many ways. We know that women's work, of course, in the house has increased exponentially all over the world. They're now teachers and, to the children and helping the children do their work. They've got the husbands at home all day long. So we know that the work has increased, but a lot of women have actually found that being able to work from home, not having to fight traffic and go to an office, has actually enabled them. And again, these are women with the luxury to not wonder where the next meal is going to come from. But have been able during this time to really jumpstart a lot of brand new initiatives, brand new programs, brand new campaigns, brand new careers. So in our experience, it's been mostly really debilitating and really negative with all of those we work with on the ground. But those we're connected to globally, there's also been another wave, smaller of course, but existent and powerful, of women who have thrived in not having to be in the workplace, outside, being able to work from home, having more time, having more space, having more freedom in that it's in their home rather than in a cubicle at a business, and have really been able to use that to develop very, very creative initiatives to help others.
Thank you so much, Sadvi, for your share. Olivia, can you give us your perspective on how did you observe the impact of COVID on women in your work?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Sadvi. And Sadvi has such a range and breadth of specific examples from her work. So I just want to say that in comparison, I can't offer as much, but what we've been doing in the COVID-19, the religious responses to COVID-19 initiative, which is run by myself and Catherine Marshall at Georgetown, is collecting a now quite vast repository of information around anything really that we find that is related to religious responses to COVID-19. And of course, the issue of gender-based violence, gender justice, gender equality. These are topics that come up from various different reports that we have gathered over the last year, now reaching year and a half almost. So the overview that I am giving is based on this reporting rather than direct experience from running a project or program in the same way that, so different to what Sadvi can present. So I just want to echo a lot of what has already been said, essentially. I think from the specific examples that Sadvi's been able to give, those have also been reported in news stories, research, examples coming up from really around the world as well. So yes, we see a few main themes recurring. The main themes that are recurring that we've basically already talked about is women leading the health response, being the majority, having the majority role in a lot of healthcare around the world in terms of the workforce, then also carrying a lot of the load in terms of some of that hidden labor, the work at home, then the labor that might happen in informal economies, that women are find their income from informal economies a lot of the time, and that was an area that was particularly impacted by lockdowns. All these elements of labor and women's roles in labor are particularly interesting in terms of how they have shifted and changed in the course of the pandemic. Of course, as well, already been stated, the impact of lockdowns on violence against women and their children also, of course, has come up very strongly in a lot of the reporting that we've seen in the repository so far. But so those are just very, very overview points. But what I want to go into a little bit more is some of the specific examples that we're seeing from around the world. So one of the areas where we're seeing organizing particularly related to faith actors is the role of women's groups that are part of a faith community. So women coming together, organizing within their faith community, and then organizing responses to COVID as part of their fellowship and solidarity together as women in their faith community. Some examples that we've seen in the repository is an interfaith women's group in Cameroon who came together to help female prisoners. As we know that people who are currently in prisons have had great risks in relation to COVID because of that environment. We've also seen many stories around the world, of course, of women religious. So women in roles as sisters, as who are a lot of the time already have a very strong social work, social care background and are doing that work anyway, have really stepped up into greater, have really continued and strengthened their work in the COVID-19 response. But also, then many sad reports of those women dying because of their roles, either together in small communities that are where there's been a COVID outbreak, and their roles on the front lines of response. And then, I think the other area where we've seen a bit more reporting and interest these are all things that we've known from before. And so the other area that's come up is early marriage, child marriage. And people have been, I think what we've seen in terms of research is that a lot of people pivoted what they were researching already to then look at COVID. And in terms of social and behavior change research, which is often connected to work with religious leaders and work with faith communities, there has been a historic interest in terms of the research world at looking at drivers of child marriage. And I think what we need, I was talking to a colleague the other day, and I think what we need to reflect upon is that, we've seen some of the ways that the reporting has been a little bit misinformed is the way that this is presented as this, the pandemic of violence against women. But of course, that has been a pandemic existing millennia before now. And so the way that this is being reported is like, oh, this is something new almost, is really underestimating or really demonstrating how much we have sidelined and ignored the history and cases of violence against women and their children, which is a worrying way that it's pretty worrying that we've seen that narrative develop in part of, the shadow pandemic, the pandemic of violence against women. It's really misrepresenting a lot of previous knowledge and work that just hasn't been at the fore. But I think as well, it then does give us an opportunity of being in this moment to come through to say, well, yes, actually, there's decades of work on this and decades of understanding. And I think that's probably what we're going to go to in the next question. So I won't go into it now about, what we can do in these kind of situations. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Those are very interesting conclusions that I have been also in this work that we have been doing with the Gender Equality Working Group. Obviously, we have been talking about the impact of COVID, but the actuality is that it has been going on for millennia, as you said. So touching upon that, and also the mentioning that mentioned by Sadvi, about this gender-based violence, domestic violence, and other types of violence that have increased as a consequence of quarantine. But other realities we also have seen, for example, we have reported here in Portugal of a decrease of complaints about domestic violence, but that shows only that the women are more restricted in their contacts with the outside, so they are not being, and they have not been able to come forward and get help. So my question to you now is, what role should religious communities play in changing societal attitudes towards women to prevent these abusive behaviors that they have suffered and they continue to suffer? So I would love to get your input on this. Sadvi, if you want to go first, please.
Sure, of course. So the power of religion and the power of faith on an individual level, of course, is that it brings us into contact with God. It gives our lives meaning and fulfillment, and not just shows us the way, but actually gives us that experience of knowing the truth of who we are and the oneness between us and the divine. But there's a power of faith and religion that's not just on the individual level. And of course, I'm speaking to the choir. We're all here because we know that power, which is the power to change how people think and therefore how they behave. And so I think that the role of religious communities cannot be overstated. It's essential. It is to our religion that people turn for our values, our ethics, our norms of what's okay, what's not. And this is especially true in places like India, where, globally we speak about statistics that I know there's some discussion around the veracity of the statistics, but nonetheless, we speak about approximately 84% of people subscribing to a faith. But in India, that number's much closer to about 99%. And it's people who really wake up in the morning like full of their faith and practice their faith. And the role of faith communities and faith leaders is essential. It's also a country where, particularly in the Hindu community, there's a very, very strong sense of what we call pop and punya. So pop would be sin, for which we're going to get, negative karmic fruits. Punya is merit, for which we're going to get positive karmic fruits. And there's a huge emphasis in people's thoughts, in their actions, on what is pop, what is punya, what's going to be the personal ramification on a karmic level of what they do. And for that, our religious leaders and religious communities are essential, because we have to keep emphasizing, and we do, but we have to do it better and louder and stronger and more frequently, emphasizing that this is wrong. Just because a woman is your wife or your daughter or employee does not mean that it's okay to beat her. And it's interesting, as just a quick momentary diversion, we see this also with aspects of abuse against children. I remember when I first came to India and we were working in schools, the difficulty that we had in getting teachers to stop beating children. And their perspective always was, well, I was hit and I turned out okay. And so what's the problem? Like, how else do you discipline children if you don't hit them? And that is such a pervasive belief in education systems, in school, in families. Whenever you try to talk about not hitting kids, people's perspective is always, why not? If I don't, they will not be disciplined. And if I was hit as a child and I'm okay, I learned my lesson. And the reason that I mention that is that there really is this sense that when your child does something wrong, you hit them, they will no longer do it. When your wife does something, or another woman in your home, your daughter, your sister, does something that you think is wrong, in their minds, rather than understanding personal lack of control, personal anger, personal impulse issues, personal violence, personal responsibility, in their mind, this is teaching a lesson. And that's where the communication around abuse is so important, both against children as well as against women. With women, we have very, very beautiful teachings in the scriptures. I mean, our Hindu scriptures are full of teachings about the divine feminine, about the mother goddess. There are lines about how where women are worshipped, their God is happy. And so there's no dearth of scriptural reference for the faith communities to turn to in their communications. And one of the things that we do, in addition to the regular work and the regular communications, is we really love to harness the power of holidays, because everybody loves to celebrate. But in India, I have to say, the way that people celebrate holidays there is just so far above and beyond anything I had seen in America ever. And there's so many holidays dedicated to the divine feminine, so many days of the year in which we are literally worshiping another form of the mother goddess. And we use those holidays, and in our religious gatherings, in our massive evening prayer ceremonies, in our social media campaigns, whether it's, Twitter, Facebook, or whether it's WhatsApp, which everyone in India has, putting out campaigns about how that mother goddess, whether it's Lakshmi, whether it's Durga, whether it's Saraswati, that mother goddess you are worshiping today exists in the form of your wife, of your daughter, of your sister, of your mother. And in the same way that you would never walk into a temple and slap the image of the goddess or beat the image of the goddess, in the same way, these women in your home are the embodiment of the goddess. And those are really powerful communications. And they're things that we do a lot and we really encourage others to do. So that's something that we found that's very, very, very powerful. Also, I think lastly, there's so much to say, but I'll end with this last thought, is that lack of gender equality, violence against women, all of that which we have seen as a centuries-old pandemic, not something that COVID brought on. It certainly exacerbated it, but definitely not something COVID brought on, is rooted in so much of a sense of separation and a sense of, again, at least in India, at least in the Hindu traditions, and I know in many other of the Eastern traditions, a sense that which women do, whether it's menstruate or whether it's give birth, is somehow dirty and impure. And so in order to bring about a change in this, we also have to change how we think about menstruation. And as long as menstruation is considered impure and they are pushed away and kept away during that time, it creates a philosophy under which, a foundation upon which women are somehow deserving of being kept away, pushed away, isolated, deprived of access to their own kitchen, their own bedroom, their own water pump. And as long as we agree that that's okay, it's not a very big leap to also believe that it's okay to teach them a lesson physically and to take out that anger because they are different. It's the same really pernicious beliefs that we've seen in issues of genocide, that we've seen in issues of slavery, that as long as we enable ourselves to think of anyone as separate, as different, as deserving of different treatment, being isolated, being deprived, it just keeps escalating. And that's one of the reasons that we're really committed to work around ending the taboo of menstruation. Because when you can get men, and especially male religious leaders, talking about the importance of menstrual hygiene, talking about removing the taboo of menstruation, it's a huge step into aspects and issues of empowerment, of equality, and of justice.
Thank you so much, Sadhvi. That's a really, really important topic that we have to put on the table and discuss, because it really is a driver for this inequality. Olivia, what is your input on this as you work with the religious communities? How can they help in this changing of attitudes towards women?
Thanks, Sophia, and thanks, Sadhvi, as ever, for your clarity on these subjects. It's very much appreciated. To pick up a little bit on what Sadhvi said about norms. So I think the way that we think about norms can help us unpick some of what's going on. A framework that we've been using from social norms theory, in fact, to get a little bit academic on the subject, has really helped us in recent work unravel the incredibly complex religious, social, cultural, economic, political web that leads to some of these norms that impact women so damagingly. And I will pick up on just the issue of child marriage, because that's the one that we have happened to be working on, but this could be applied to many and other aspects of gender inequalities and gender-based violence. So I think there's a few types of norms, and we can describe them in certain ways. And understanding these different types of norms help us pinpoint what in any given context is leading to the behavior. So one of them is very obvious, which is simply you don't have access to information that allows you to understand what might be the consequences of your behavior. So you are not aware of the consequences of child marriage on children, and you do the behavior because you're not fully aware of the harmful consequences. And some of the other norms, though, that are a little bit more complicated are, you have something called descriptive norms. You don't need to remember these terms per se, but that would be when it's a belief about what other people do. So you do it because you think most other people are doing it, or you do it because that's just what people do. It's just normal. Another level is beliefs about what other people approve of, because you're doing it because you think it's right and in the best interests of those that you love and serve. And you do it because you think other people think you should do it. So you're kind of looking out around you and thinking, that's what they're going to approve of if I do it. Then you might have another norm that you do it because you fear exclusion and you want social rewards and acceptance. Because if you do this behavior, so say in this case, child marriage, you will be included because that's what everyone else is doing. So you will be socially rewarded and accepted for doing that behavior. Or I mean, what also fits into that is you'll do it just because there's no legal pressure, there's no risk really, there's no framework that's telling you not to do it. There's not going to be any punishment, which is the case in many scenarios. Or you do it because of financial gain. So there's the economic opportunity element to the behavior. And then finally, there's a risk perception element, which is you do it because you don't think the risk will affect you. So you perhaps know that there are consequences, but you don't think that the risk is going to affect you. So that's all a bit theoretical, but to put it into action, I think the thing that we have to always emphasize, which Sadvi has already brought up, is that these norms are just as relevant to a religious community as to a non-religious or other kind of any social grouping. And they also get then put through the lens of the way that the religious beliefs and practices are structured in that community. So, for example, some of the things that we see with child marriage about norms is you have this mix of dominant cultural and religious patriarchal views that end up saying that you should do this because that's what people do, because you're existing within that patriarchal structure. And so that's the norm that you're stepping into. Of course, we also know that particularly in disasters, in crises, that the need for that economic opportunity, that in this example, it would be tied to child marriage, but there's other, again, other examples where there'd be an economic opportunity. The economic opportunity is what drives people to practice that behavior. And again, that's where we knew this would happen in COVID because it happens in so many other examples of crises and pressure points that people experience around the world. There's so much that just unfortunately, tragically can be predicted because we know that these norms are operating in these ways. Another one that might happen is that religious leaders are protecting their position because they have been the ones traditionally marrying and being involved in those rituals, and they see that it's a threat to their position in the community to step back from that. And so you're doing that because you're trying to maintain the social status. So that's the kind of the norms that you're stepping into there. And so all of these things are happening simultaneously, they're interlinked. As I said, it's a complex web, but in any given context, I think that we're not doing that level of analysis to truly understand. And the problem that's happening with a lot of the faith engagement, and indeed the rush to faith engagement in the COVID pandemic, which we have seen, is that there's not that intricate understanding of how these social norms are playing out to put pressures on people to practice behaviors that are ultimately harming women and children. And women harming other women. This is not to say this is just a one direction thing. These norms are affecting all of us. And I've been just my final point, because I'm sorry, I've gone on and on with this point, but it's just so interesting to know exactly what's going on. But the rush to faith engagement in the COVID-19 pandemic has come from the fact that people have thought, oh, we need to do public health messaging. Oh, we can talk to religious leaders to do public health messaging. That is too simple an equation. Because as we can see from that theory, from the norms, from all the different pressure points on people, the simple equation of saying, oh, religious leaders will have this information and then cascade it out to 100,000 other people is not understanding. I mean, there is worth in that work, but it's not understanding that actually perhaps it's not the religious leader you need to talk to. Maybe it's the leader of the women's group, or maybe it's the wife of the pastor. or something like that. And because in this context, it's this norm that's influencing the way that this is working. So I think that we are in a moment that has potential for faith engagement, but it also has potential for a lot to go wrong and a lot of further instrumentalization of religious leaders, faith actors, if we don't keep essentially repeating the point that this is an incredibly complex situation. Please take the time to analyze and truly understand what's going on. Sorry for
Thank you. No worries. Thank you so much, Olivia. And these are important points, and I'm going to I think I would love to have some questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask you a final question based or looking forward, not to be all of COVID-19 that we are discussing here, but looking forward. How is this bringing us, or can this bring us an opportunity for this topic, this specific topic of gender equality? So my question is regarding the role that women usually have on leadership positions within the communities. So usually we have seen them as minor, and what must be done in the aftermath of the pandemic to change this perception of the minor role of women in leadership and provide greater opportunities for women to take these positions of leadership?
So the lack of women in religious leadership, much like gender-based violence, is something that we've been faced with since the beginning. I mean, long before the pandemic, since we've probably had religious communities, in the same way that there's probably been gender-based violence in families since we've had families. So this is a massive problem. I wanted, before I go into that, to just touch on two very quick related points. The first was in response to what you were saying at the end of the last question, with regard to the violence against women. And I think one of the very important things for us to do, and I want to mention this because I realize that today both the panelists and the participants come from such a varied, diverse array of arenas, that in countries like India, and I imagine this is true in a lot of the rest of the world, where you have joint families. So you have mothers-in-law who are there, or mothers who are there, while a wife, for example, is being beaten. So let's say that you have a man who is beating his wife. It's very likely that his mother is in the home as well. And I mention this because what I have seen is that a lot of that which is violence against women, and whether it's the actual abuse of women in the home, whether it's lack of menstrual hygiene, all of this, so much of it actually is either perpetuated directly or simply allowed to happen by women. And I believe that this is because the women themselves experienced it in their life. And for them to admit that it's not okay is for them to actually have to go back and relook at their own lives and to acknowledge that they too were subject to something that was not right. But that needs to happen. And I think that a very, very powerful step that we could collectively in all of our different arenas do is to look at what healing would look like for different groups of women, because obviously in a lot of cases it's not going to be a sit down conversation. It may be ritual, it may be something else, but to bring together the mothers who are watching their daughters or their daughters-in-law get beaten, get sent off during the time of their periods, get deprived, be suppressed, at a time when they actually could do something about it. I mean, if a mother literally tried to stop her son from beating his wife, I believe in many cases that woman could be successful. And it's a really important question that I've been thinking a lot about, of why don't they do that? And the reason that I have come to understand is because they also were beaten, and in their own mind, they have to understand it as okay, so that it doesn't require them to revisit their entire lives. But if, as the faith communities, we put together programs of bringing together the mothers, the grandmothers in healing circles, or whatever was right for that culture, so that they could together collectively acknowledge that what happened to them was not right. It was wrong, it was painful, but they survived. But there is no need for them to continue to perpetrate this on younger women, simply in order to continue to feel that what happened to them was okay. So I realize that's not in line with this question, but it was something that was percolating in my mind from the last question. And it seems like a really important opportunity for us to think about how to heal the older generations so that they do grab their sons' hands if it's a situation where they're able, and stop their sons from beating their wives or their own daughters. With regard then back to this question of women's leadership, in India, we see, interestingly, very, very successful women's leadership in pretty much every realm other than religion. So politics, India's far ahead of America in terms of having women at the helm, prime ministership, presidentship, in government, in even the police force, things that are so traditionally male. There's a vast female police force. In business, in so many places, you really do see a very vibrant role of women. But in religion, it's not there. And I think that's where, interestingly, we really need the allies of the men, because this is something that's going to take men from within the community, within the religious community, to break that. I know what I've seen with my guru, who is so committed to bringing in women. I've watched him do it. I've seen what he's gone through. I've seen the difficulties, the arguments, the fights that he has had with other religious leaders in order to enable women to sit on stages, to speak on stages. He once had to threaten to take an entire program that we were doing with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that he was going to take the program into the street if the religious community whose venue we were at, where we were going to host the program, didn't allow the women on the stage. But that's something that we really need to reach out to our male allies for. And they exist. They absolutely exist. They exist in every religious tradition. And to harness that power to help create the space into which we, the women, then walk. But that initial space I've seen is much more successfully created when it is created by male leaders who are already part of the community than by women leaders wanting to get into the community.
Thank you so much. And there is no worries that you have introduced that issue. That's very interesting, and that we will all. I think that's an incredible way to put the problem, and that we will all consider that in our next thoughts, and even in our working group, we will have that in consideration in our policy briefs. Olivia, your thoughts on this, please.
Yeah, I'll just be quick. So I think women's leadership, I think we're all involved in this subject because it's personally important to us, right? So I went very academic on my last point. I'll go a bit more personal on this point, which is that, you know, I definitely grew up in a religious community that had rejected women's leadership. And to the extent that that is now a community that I have left and been able to step into other positions later on in my life where I have sought out spiritual leadership from women. And not everyone has that opportunity as well. And I think that there's any position that we look at, and anything that, you know, any report that I look at, any kind of guidance note that I look at that's coming from these, maybe from the UN or something, if I think back and think, could I apply this to my own life, to my own religious community, and if the answer is yes, that's when I start taking it seriously. If it's a kind of guidance note that's very othering, that's talking down, that's when I get particularly worried, because these are issues that are prevalent wherever we are, wherever we may be in our lives, and whichever context we're in. And these are issues that we are invested in on a personal level, as well as in terms of our work life and our careers as well. So I just want to kind of reiterate or support what Sadly's been saying, and look to thinking through how whatever we learn in our work life is also connected to what we've experienced in our personal life.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you so much for sharing that personal part. Right now, I would like to take some questions from the audience. I don't know if we have some, but we are already tight on schedule. So I don't know if there is any questions. I don't think so. Okay, so if as there are no questions, I would like to thank both of you for being here, and to share with us all of these wonderful views and opinions and perspectives that otherwise we would probably not have access to. So this is always an interesting experience to share something that we are not reaching from our Google searches or from our reads. So thank you so much. And I think that with all that we have been saying, we have to agree that gender equality is beneficial for communities. It's very helpful in our construction of the post-pandemic world, and that women are, as we like to say in our working group, transformation agents. So let's hope this conversation has inspired someone to step up, to see things in other perspectives. And thank you so much. I would just like to make a marketing point for our second webinar. The Gender Equality Working Group is preparing in the 27th of July. We will explore the intersectionality of policy, gender, and religion. I think it's going to be a very interesting webinar as well. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. And thank you all of the participants, and yeah.
Thank you, everyone.